The Joe Rogan Experience.
The Washingtons and the Jeffersons and the Patrick Henrys and the John Adams, and they didn't know they were those people. Right? They didn't know they were a planter, and they were a businessman, and they were a lawyer, and they were this guy and a planter or a scientist, and they were just risking their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor for something much bigger than anything else.
And it's also the incredibly complex system of checks and balances that they divide to prevent tyranny.
Oh, it's so unbelievably beautiful. I can't believe you brought that up. So we have a technical problem, which I'll share with you, or I thought it was a technical problem, which is the climax. If you're making a film called The American Revolution, the climax is the Battle of Yorktown. It happens in October of 1781. The British don't leave New York for 2 more years until 1783. They're occupying New York, which they took over in the summer of 76. And our Articles of Convention are doing nothing. Our Articles of Confederation are doing nothing. They're toothless. They can't be a government. And so in 1787, we have this constitutional convention that happens in Philadelphia, 4 months. They hammer together the shortest constitution in the world, and it is exactly that. Jefferson's writing in from Paris, who representing our interests, going, but what about this? What about, they're trying to check the possibility of somebody being somebody who would try to take advantage of the system and rig it to their own benefit. And so all of those elaborately beautiful checks and balances. Article 1 is the legislative. Article 2 is the executive. It delineates, Article 3, the judicial, it delineates what the responsibilities are and the way in which the system has worked and fits and starts with lots of problems. And you know, there's something encouraging about seeing how divided Americans were back then, because we're always wringing our hands, oh, we're so divided. Okay, human beings are divided. And my feeling is that if you succumb to argument, right, which is what we do. The novelist Richard Powers said, the best arguments in the world, and that's all we do is argue, the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is to say change somebody's point of view, is a good story. Because a good story allows contradiction and undertow. You can have a George Washington who is complex, flawed, rash, makes terrible tactical decisions on the battlefield, and yet without him, historian after historian after historian says, without him we don't have a country. And you can take that and put that in the bank. And at the same time understand the dimensions of, we all have feet of clay. We're all flawed in some way. And to try to design a narrative that isn't, filled with that kind of morning and again sanitized Madison Avenue kind of view of American history, nor is it that unforgiving revisionism that wants to throw out anybody who did something bad back then. You then permit a world to exist in which they suddenly seem familiar to you. Like, you can argue with other people and see that you get nowhere, but you also know if you're married or you have kids or you have friends or you're in business that you actually are more engaged in story and tolerance and understanding and listening. And so part of our job as filmmakers, strangely enough, is not to impose ourselves on the material. As I said before, we're umpires calling balls and strikes. It's to listen to the material. What is it telling us? What is it saying about this circumstances of, say, the resistance in Boston in the early days leading up to the revolution? To try to understand nuance. Every school kid knows that when the 60 or 70 people, all white males, both rich and poor in Boston, dumped the 40 tons of tea in the harbor, they were dressed crudely as Native Americans. And if you ask a kid, why were they dressed that way? They'll go, well, just to disguise, to put the blame on somebody else. It was to say, we're not part of the mother country anymore.
Really?
We're here. We're Aboriginal. We are Americans. We are distinct. We've been having complaints about British citizenship. We're arguing British law. But all of a sudden, those laws have been broken out into natural laws. And we're telling you that we're not trying to blame it on anyone else. Nobody would for a second have thought that the Native Americans would have dumped the tea. They weren't burdened by the tea tax. What they were doing was saying, we are, and it's so ironic given the history of our relationship to the dispossession of native lands.
Right.
They are saying we are Aboriginal. This is what the scholar Phil Deloria says. So wow, and then
Newly
you get
adopted Aboriginal.
right. We're saying we're not of the mother country. We're in essence kind of filing divorce papers by dressing as the people who originally inhabited this country dressed. Nobody's fooled. Nobody's trying to blame.
How did you figure that out?
It's listening to scholarship. It's thinking, of course, that you're not going to have. No one in their right mind is going to say, "Oh, the Native Americans did it because they're protesting the tea tax." They're not paying the tea tax, right?
Right.
So it's like, you then go and then you talk to a scholar, in this case Phil Deloria, who's been studying Native stuff, and he goes, "Just think about it. You're dressed crudely as this. You're making a statement to Britain that we are no longer we're severing ties." Now this is well before this is. December of 1773, the guns are going to fire in about 18 months at Lexington, a little bit less than 18 months at Lexington and Concord on April 19th. But it is all of these little moments that lead up to boycott of British goods. Women take a huge part of the role of the resistance. You've got people like Samuel Adams, who is a failure as a brewer and a tax collector. It's sort of interesting. You can't make this shit up. Who is his whole job is to keep his fellow colonists alive to their grievances. When things calm down, the Brits sort of retreat. He goes, "Oh, no, it's just going to get worse. It's going to get worse." And so you meet these characters that sound an awful lot like characters that occupy our large media space. And it was occupying the large media space of the colonists from New Hampshire. I live in a tiny village. The Walpole Gazette was read all the way in Georgia. People exchanged ideas and thought about things and were trying to figure out, even as late as even after Lexington conquered, even after the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is June of 75, even after the other things that were happening, by early 76, nobody's absolutely, not nobody, but there's not a majority will for independency, as they called it. And then Thomas Paine comes in and writes this pamphlet, Common Sense. And all of a sudden people going, "Oh, yeah." And by June, there's a committee of the Second Continental Congress, and Franklin's in charge of it, and there's John Adams is on the committee, and then there's a 32-year-old lawyer from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson who's given the first crack at doing this thing. And what does he write? He writes, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin, who's the old man, the chairman, if you will, of this little committee, goes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Joe, there is nothing in the world less self-evident than the idea that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But as someone pointed out, it's the old lawyer's dodge. You just tell them that it's self-evident, not just sacred and undeniable, lovely phrasing on Jefferson's part. But if you say self-evident, then we're not arguing about this thing. We're saying that everything that you're about to hear is without argument, which is a really in-your-face, bold move. And the intimacy, the human intimacy that gets communicated when you spend even a little amount of time trying to parse this, trying to get at the heart of the dynamics of dumping tea and dressed as Indians or writing these words, that mankind are disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, meaning, yeah, we've taken it, all this through human history, and guess what? We're not going to take it anymore.
When they first devised this system of government, what were they basing it on? I know part of it was on the Greeks, but how did they make it to the point where even today we marvel at it?
Yeah.
250 years later, people go back and look what they did. This is extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. So lots of factors. First of all, it was true what I said. They have experienced at a reserve and at sort of, as somebody said, salutary neglect. The people didn't pay attention to the colonists. And they had learned suddenly they were more literate than their British compatriots. They paid less taxes, and they paid it to local stuff. And they had land. And most folks in England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland were living dependent lives. They'd worked the land of somebody else for 1,000 years. So they've got this British constitutional monarchy, which is a really strong thing. And King George is not a bad guy. He really does believe that Parliament has this role to play, and the House of Lords and the House of Commons. They're kind of the checks and balances that we'd think of. But they're also in the middle of the Enlightenment, where they're beginning to say that there are certain rights that are natural. That's the word that I think Jefferson would use. That is to say, they are not bestowed by a monarch. They're natural, that all men are created equal. This is big stuff. And this is distilling, in Jefferson's words in the Declaration, a century of Enlightenment thinking. And the Enlightenment has been a kind of philosophical and human and kind of governmental dynamic that's coming out of the Renaissance, right? We know what the Renaissance is in art, Leonardo da Vinci, Bernini, all of this stuff, some music. But what it's doing on a social scene and a philosophical scene is it's doing that. And they're reaching back to antiquity, as you say, and they're pulling back some of the best ideas of self-discipline, of temperance, of virtue, all of these sorts of things. But then, because they've experienced all these years of this misuse and distrust from the mother country 3,000 miles away, takes at least a month for information to get there. The Britain wins, with our help, what we call the French and Indian War, which was a global war called the 7 Years' War. And they've got now the biggest, most far-flung empire on earth, but they can't protect its own colonists who are trying to pour over the Appalachians to take Native American land, and it's causing uprisings. And so they say, you can't go over 1763. You can't go over that. And, oh, by the way, we're broke, so we need you to help us pay for this stuff. But we don't have any representation there. So native lands, taxation, representation become this thing. And it goes on for so long. They've watched the ineffectiveness of their government while they're prosecuting the revolution, and the ineffectiveness of the Articles of Confederation that emerges from fighting the war and is trying to figure out how to make it work, that they go into that Constitutional Convention and they are determined to figure out every possible angle to forestall authoritarianism, to balance the relationships between the states, to have the checks and balances between the three forms of government, the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. It is a beautiful thing. And what was so incredible is that it fostered one of the greatest public debates ever in human history, because they had emerged from this bloody, costly civil war. Civil war means lots of deaths of civilians. That didn't happen in our Civil War, except in Missouri and a little bit of Kansas. 6 people died at the Siege of Vicksburg, less than 20 at Atlanta, 2 in Gettysburg, the greatest battle ever fought in North America. But the American Revolution, there are battles in the South in which you might have one British officer leading Loyalist troops. Every person on each side is an American, and they're killing each other. And they're doing it not just in set battles, but in little guerrilla actions, almost like the Viet Cong attacking patrols in South Vietnam. I mean, it is really bad stuff. And so they say, we're going to ratify this, but we want a Bill of Rights too. We want to enshrine these things that we fought for. And so you have no establishment of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to assemble and redress grievances, right to bear arms, free and fair trial, end of cruel and unusual punishment. All these things become the set pieces of. I made a film a couple of years ago on the U.S. and the Holocaust, what we knew, when we knew it, what we did, what we didn't do, what we should have done. And I was at some event, and somebody raised their hand and said, is the Holocaust the most important event since the birth of Jesus Christ in world history? And I just immediately said, no, it's the American Revolution. It's the American Revolution. I mean, this is a sea change in the course of human events. And man, we don't know enough about it. We don't know enough of the interiors of it that are complicated. I have in my editing room a neon sign. I've had it for a decade and a half in cursive, lowercase cursive. It says, it's complicated. Because there's not a filmmaker on earth that if the scene's working, you don't touch it. But we have spent the last 50 years touching those scenes, right? You know what I mean? Going in, maybe it's lesser, but it's truer and it's got more dynamism and it's got more contours. It feels like it's accurate to what actually happened, which is more complicated than our sort of simple binary discussions of what history is.